be great. So welcome to the Global Masterclass on ASEAN Brands. I'm Vivian Francis from the admissions team, and this evening I will have Hamid Karim, who's joining me from the admissions team as well, and Professor Willem Smit, who's right now in the Netherlands. He's self-isolating. So I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction about Professor Willem. He is an assistant professor of marketing at the Asia School of Business and an international faculty fellow at MIT Sloan. His main expertise lies in strategy making and managerial cognition, particularly in the areas of digital marketing, global branding, and new venture marketing. Also, Willem has published several the Journal of Business and the Financial Times, among others. And now, without further ado, I'd like to pass the virtual floor to Professor Willem.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you for your kind words and this wonderful virtual floor. Welcome, everyone. Hello. I hope you're all safe. And I'm quite grateful that you have found the time to join us for this session, because I'm quite excited that you have shown interest in a topic of research that I'm quite busy with. I'm quite interested in brands, in internationalization, digitization, and in the region, in ASEAN. So to give you a flavor of also of how we teach and how we do research at Asia School of Business, we developed this masterclass, and I would like to propose kind of 5 steps that we're going to talk about today. First, I'd like to start with a manifesto on branding, kind of telling you about our standpoint and philosophy on branding and research at the school. With that, we move to talking about what is underlying a strength of brands on creating impact. Then we move on how brands kind of increase their reach and internationalize, and how that creation of reach may be different in the ASEAN context. With that, I hope to share with you some preliminary findings on the Asian brands that we have identified that are standing out and getting international popularity. So, to start with our manifesto on branding. We live in a changing, uncertain, and increasingly popularized world. We live also in a branded world. We live in a world where brands are continuously seeking to engage better with people who, in turn, have changing needs and desires. So we live in a world where brands at least need to respond to changes to stay relevant. So brands and changes cannot be seen in isolation. They are inherently connected. And some people in the field would actually argue that this relationship needs to be taken a step further and to go beyond that fellowship, that connection between changes and brand. Brands can actually change the world in a positive way because they have a very strong position and resources that help to engage social movements, maybe to proactively shape our future. So brands have that position, that power to change the world. And that is also thought of by the father of modern marketing, Philip Kotler, who actually says a step further than that. He says that brands no longer can stay neutral. They need to take a stance. They have to, because people expect brands to help solve the world's biggest problems. So I'd like to make this interactive as much as we can from this virtual floor. And I'd like to ask you a question, you in the audience. So a question you need to answer pretty quickly in 10 seconds. And I'll give you two possible answers. We would like to have your point of view. Which brands are stronger? Global brands or local brands to creating that impact? Global brands perhaps because they have greater resources and better reach, the local brands, maybe because they have more in-depth knowledge of the local situation. All right, the poll is running. 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Yes, and we can end the poll. And we have, can we share the results? Okay. We have a tremendous majority vote on global brands. Nonetheless, there is still, I think, impact from local brands. But you as a class, you are in agreement on average with previous academic research. So in earlier in the past, they found a strong preference for global brands among populations. There's 85% of in certain countries preferred a global brand compared to a homegrown or local choice. Other studies found a positive attitude of global brands that would then lead to more better purchase intention and loyalty. Then the third one found, a third study found a strong correlation between the globality of a brand, the perception that a brand is omnipresent and present in many other countries, and that the correlation with prestige and perceptions of quality. So to think about this further, this kind of nice outcome for global brands of perception, attitude, and preference, there were colleagues that said, okay, what determines actually that global brand premium? What are the key characteristics that people associate with global brands? So they did a qualitative study, a quantitative study to test what they found in the first qualitative study. And they found that the first dimension is that global brands have a very strong quality signal. It is the social proof that is extended and proven in multiple countries because more people buy it. Therefore, people infer that it is a better quality. The second dimension is that global brands connect to the global myth. They serve as a symbol of the global village. They serve as a symbol of being part of a greater group of citizens of the world, of being united in the planet. A third dimension was actually social responsibility. And that is what people have higher expectations of global companies because they have extraordinary influence and they can use that for the good. So they have higher ethical expectations of global brands. So these are the three aspects that underline, that constitute this global brand premium. In my own study, and actually triggered by today's situation, COVID-19 pandemic, I started to ask the question, like many companies now are under pressure and also talk about the importance of social distancing. They take measures, so they start to do good as well, not only communicating. So I thought maybe a kind of a litmus test for global brands is to see, well, while they are under pressure, do they still come to the rescue? So to do this study, I looked at the sample frame of Interbrand's top 100 best global brands, and then I split them up in 3 groups. I split them up in the groups in terms of what was their impact of the announcement of the pandemic on March 11. And since then, how much did it go down in those weeks? So one group of brands are heavily affected. On the left-hand side, those are the ones that suffered a 40% decrease in stock markets. Well, there are also brands that were mildly affected or hardly affected by the spread of the coronavirus, such as pharma, such as Netflix, streaming videos, such as food companies. They are mildly affected. So to see what they have done in response to the COVID-19 situation, I collected data from their corporate newsrooms and looked at their press releases, which were released over these months and which were COVID related, and I analyzed their texts. So the texts were asking, the texts were analyzed there emerged kind of 6 types of content, of actions that they did. First 3 are kind of accommodating, well, giving information to shareholders and other stakeholders about the impact, financial impact of COVID, showing empathy, a letter for the CEO to employees or other stakeholders, but also adapting internal operations with social distancing, working from home, etc. Then the other 3 were actually going out of your way, assisting customers, suppliers, and partners, giving them extra credit facilities, or actually shifting manufacturing and distribution to personal protective equipment, ventilators, and sanitizers that are in high demand by the healthcare providers and other frontliners. Furthermore, whether they gave monetary or non-monetary donations in kind to NGOs. So you can kind of see that there's an emphasis. Most of the press releases are about adapting internal operations, but there are also ones that announce what they do to help the world. So if we then split it up into the different groups, then the 2 groups are still doing a lot. So it shows, in my view, it shows that global brands, even if they are heavily affected, they go out of their way to use their influence for the better. So the heavily affected, they maybe responded a bit later than the not so much affected brands, like 7 days instead of 5 or 6 days. They didn't talk so much about it, but they all reacted. So it shows that there are not very much significant differences besides in response to their financial situation. So we asked you, and now I turn to Vivian, we asked you about your favorite brands. Vivian.
All right, so based on the responses, we've got a few brands, 6 in particular. So we've got Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Ping An, and Huawei.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So these are actually all global or international brands from the US and China. Maybe Ping An is not so well known, but it's an insurance company from China, internationalizing now. And to explore that idea of where do global brands come from is also one of the reasons I came to Asia, because I'm curious to see which are the new brands coming from this part of the world as the economic center of gravity shifts towards the East. And if you look at the, what also previously mentioned, top ranking of Interbrand, of the top global brands, you see actually that shift has not materialized yet into an increase in global brands, in international recognition of brands from Asia. And that's quite interesting that maybe there's a delay, and I think there's certainly a delay, but I think we'll see in the future an increase that hasn't yet evolved. So if we look if we ask ourselves the questions, where do they come from? Interbrand gives us this answer. Most of them are from the US, then a significant part from Europe, and then a part of 10 to 15% from Asia. If we were to ask that question slightly differently, if we were to ask where do the most valuable brands come from, and that is a ranking from brand Z, then we see a slightly different distribution. We still see a very prominent number from the US, but actually we see a significant part from China's part. So there's a lot of brands that are in China, very valuable, but they only have domestic presence and not so much developed yet international presence. So that could mean, that can point to a reservoir of big brands that could step out, go out to markets they find interesting. So in that decision to go abroad, companies take into regard what are the advantages and the disadvantages, the benefits and the costs of building an international presence. And what we spoke about earlier is about, there is a big advantage of internationalizing the brand because there's a brand premium that you can ask. There's a brand premium that helps you in the business. There's also economies of scale in production and distribution, but also you can spread the marketing overhead and have lower marketing costs. You also get exposed to a more wide ranges of context and ideas that helps you bring in the best ideas and use them very quickly and efficiently. So those are the benefits that people or firms see in internationalizing their brand. Then that comes at a cost because sometimes when you go abroad, you need to make adaptations to the local needs because not every market is the same as your home market. So when differences are greater, you need to make greater adaptation. That could be in response to changing other needs and wants and usage patterns of products and services. Also the way that people respond to marketing. So maybe some markets are more price sensitive than others or use different types of media channels. They can also have a different legal environment and channels. So those are things that you need to take into account because you cannot just replicate what you did so well.
Baca diam kan? Yasin baca kuat sikit macam nak nampak ya. Baru ya.
So in the sense that there is a premium to be reached, you would go if the premium is more than the local adaptation cost, you would go abroad. And maybe you wouldn't go to those markets where the adaptation costs are high. So you would specifically look to markets that are maybe similar, that are local, that the local adaptation costs are lower. So that brings actually to that strategizing of internationalization. And then obviously when firms think about international opportunities, it heavily depends on the information that they receive. So when you're in Canada, you will receive actually a lot of information from the US because that is nearby. When you're in Peru, you receive a lot of information from Chile or from Bolivia because they are relatively nearby. So that is the first principle. Firms tend to internationalize to local markets or locally adjacent markets. But there is another heuristic, another way of deciding that is also comes in play, and that is how similar markets are. Because markets get information more from, relatively more information from markets that are similar to them. For instance, we take this example of a Canadian firm going abroad. First choice would be the US, but what would be the second market? Would that be Mexico, or would that be, which is physically further away, would that be the UK? Which is culturally, in terms of psychic distance, so mentally closer by, because language is the same, there's some shared cultural values, economic development is very similar, education, etc. So that could be another choice in addition to Australia. So psychic distance in internationalization patterns is still very much occurring in internationalization strategies. So what is it then to internationalize to or in ASEAN? So probably those of you from Southeast Asia, these are facts you clearly know already. It's a huge market, way more than NAFTA and EU. There's tremendous growth that makes it very attractive to come here and to internationalize here. There's also great effort of ASEAN themselves to make it easier to trade and to invest in each other's countries. So there's been great success. But there is maybe some psychic distance. So I would like again to turn a question to you and ask you, what do you think? Which regional markets are easier for internationalization? Is that NAFTA? Is that EU? Or is that, ASEAN? The question is, by the way, correct on your screen. Yeah? All right. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, close the poll. And we have a very exciting race between ASEAN and EU. It's very tight. It's interesting to see this. I hope that we can actually plot this on people that are more familiar with ASEAN compared to people that are abroad. But if you would look kind of from the outside and you would compare the psychic differences among the countries in NAFTA, among the countries in EU, and among the countries in ASEAN, you would see that overall there is a greater diversity in ASEAN. And that could be, so that's partly because of a lot of different languages, a lot of different religions, a lot of different education levels in and within the countries, in and between the countries, I should say, and also different political systems. So if you look from outside, maybe you would not see that it's so attractive to internationalize here. But maybe for you that are inside, you recognize those opportunities because you're closer by, and you probably see also those forces of homogenization. So these measures of psychic distance are rather static measures, I should say, because I think in a vibrant region like ours, there's a lot of new changes going on that can have tremendous new influence on the psychic distance between the countries. A whole group is born digitally, digital natives. There's a great internet penetration, smartphone usage, time spent on mobiles, social media activity, e-commerce booming. So after COVID, what would be this new level playground? And I would think that with this new infrastructure and adoption of new technologies, people changing their lifestyles to a more digitized way, we'll actually, I think, see two possible scenarios panning out. One is maybe there could be a more homogeneous market, more similar, but there could also be a more fragmentized market. And maybe that's because the channels of media starts fragmentalizing, starts to be more prolific, more dispersed. And it could be that there's actually more differences within a country than across. And that actually, I think, would give an advantage to the brands that know the local situation better. So that leads to the question of what are those upcoming brands that have that proximity advantage, that can really monitor and influence the local situation. So to look at that, upcoming studies or upcoming brands, I'm conducting 2 studies. One is on a test, which are the brands, whether homegrown brands can actually fight against the BAT brands, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and other Chinese digital giants, and GAFA from the US and other US digital players. So to look at this, we look at simply, and this is joint work with my dear colleague Renato Oliveira de Lima, a political scientist who is also interested in these political internationalizations. So we look in this sense at app downloads from 9 different verticals, and we see different competition levels. Some are more competitive, the verticals are more competitive than others. And then we divide them into groups GAFA group versus BAT group versus others and homegrown brands. We then look at, okay, we have data on 32 countries, of which 3 are ASEAN. We group them, those countries, we range them, that's what you see on this graph here, on how close they are to the US versus to China. For instance, on the left-hand side, you see a country which is more closer to the US than to China, which is Sweden. And then if you would follow the measures that we talked about earlier, about politics, education, economic, etc., then Indonesia is the closest to China relative to the US. So we have relative differences of psychic distance in this graph. The 3 countries that are in our data set are Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And so to look at whether which brands are winning in these verticals, where it is actually a play of platforms and the winner takes all, we look at market share downloads. So in Malaysia, we see that BAT was very strong in 2018 and actually lost in 2019 significant market share of app downloads. And those were with big apps of 16 apps. GAFA has 36 brands or app brands, and they reached 40%. There's a huge increase of ASEAN homegrown brands that has grown from 12% to almost 22%. So there's a huge shift from BAT brands to other brands. In Singapore, we see a similar situation, although not as strong. There's much more moving to others and ASEAN. In Indonesia, we see a more similar pattern as we see in Malaysia. That is more GAFA and especially doubling of ASEAN, which is quite, I think, exciting that local brands, homegrown brands, just know how to hyper-localize in this market. To identify which are those brands beyond the digital brands that are popular across countries, that are appreciated by consumers from other ASEAN countries, we looked at social media platforms. We took data from 6 countries, the biggest ASEAN countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. We took the data from Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and we looked at which are the most popular 250 brands in each of these platforms, in each of these markets. And then we found our data set grew to 2,645 brands that are strong in ASEAN, at least strong in one of the platforms and in one of the countries. And if you then kind of look at the data that we have, you will find this typical kind of a long tail where there are very few major brands and there are a lot of small brands. So that is in YouTube, in Facebook and Twitter, and depending on the country, there's more diversity or more skewed to certain select group of brands. If you look at the most popular across platforms and countries, we see these brands coming in, which is actually more, has more Chinese brands like Oppo and Huawei, but we also have some American brands of fast food, Pizza Hut and KFC, then Taiwanese, Japanese, Korean, and then some local Zalora and Lazada. So here's kind of that ranking, and it's a very many of these usual suspects of global or international brands that we have. If we then look a little bit further and look for the ASEAN brands where they are strong, we actually then compare in how many countries they are popular. And we developed this matrix of how many countries they are popular. And that's, I point here to the graph, the table that is on the left-hand side, which is kind of on the horizontal axis is the amount of countries, 1, 2, 3 to 6, and then many platforms, the amount of platforms they are popular in. So there are a lot of brands that are only popular in one country and only in one platform. That's 1,763 brands. There is on the other extreme, 20 brands that are popular across countries and across platforms. And of those, we find 3 ASEAN brands, ASEAN-born brands. But if we also include brands that are only popular in 5 or 4 countries, then we come up to these 7 all ASEAN Asian-born brands. Lazada, Grab, AirAsia, Traveloka, Zalora, Shangri-La, and Guardian. If we then look at some other, so if we plot all those brands that we found in addition that are not as popular in all markets, but are still have international popularity, we kind of get this graph that we see actually the new brands, they are all digitized. That's amazing to see. And that takes me to almost to the closure of the class. We talked about the manifesto of branding. We talked about what is the strength of global brands, where does that global brand premium come from? How can you internationalize this by choosing the right brand, the right markets to go into? What would it mean to go to ASEAN or internationalize within ASEAN? And what are those upcoming ASEAN brands? And so we shared not only a manifesto, I shared 2 theories on global brand premium and psychic distance. I shared 3 studies, and then I would like to leave you with 4 takeaways. So after this class, I hope I can give you an exam on what are the advantages and disadvantages of internationalizing brands. You could explain to me what is so unique about internationalizing ASEAN, and is that changing? Is that changing in the advantage of homegrown brands? And what are these upcoming brands, and can you name at least 10? And with that, I would like to open the floor, this virtual floor, for your questions. Vivian.
All right, so we have a few questions coming in. I'm going to start reading them. The first one, do you believe of local champions or science?
Do you believe in local champions, or?
Do you believe that the rise of ASEAN brands will lead to the rise of local champions or M&A activity to acquire them by global brand giants?
I think both will happen, right? There's a great book that talks about internationalization of brands from emerging markets, and they explain 8 different routes to internationalize. And to internationalize, one of route is through mergers and acquisitions, acquiring brands abroad. And so I'm sure that we'll see more of that. I think Lazada is an example of Alibaba buying Lazada and building a presence here. That's also what Alibaba did in other markets. And I'm sure there are other examples as well. And I think maybe that we'll see a mix of both, of still brands that wanna want and can keep their internationalization independent and become a strong ASEAN brand. Yeah. Next question. Vivian, I don't hear you.
Sorry, I lost you for a bit, Willem. But the questions are coming in from the chat box. So if you can just look at some of the questions that we've moderated,
all right,
you can start answering them as well.
All right, let me see the chat. Okay. So Vivian, how many questions can I do?
That's really up to you, but I'm guessing you have about 10 to 15 minutes. So depends on how long it takes for you to answer the questions. The second one is, how significant is the difference between the heavily affected brands versus mildly affected brands?
Okay, so good question. And there's not the significance. And that is actually what I think, that's what I wanted. That was my hypothesis in the sense of what I wanted. My hypothesis was more like, even though they are heavily affected, they want to stay to be good citizens. So they need to do good, as well as the brands that have been less affected. You, however, see a slight delay. Maybe that is a little bit of hesitation, but that slight delay in issuing press releases and announcing good actions. But that could be, but that is not significant. It's a very, very good question. Thank you.
All right, the next one. How to increase brand loyalty for ASEAN brands?
Okay, good. I think my best advice that I can give for that is to take the strategic brand management course at our school. But that basically, all jokes aside, but that basically introduces the concept of the customer-based brand equity model. And that customer-based brand equity model basically helps you to think through which are the layers you need to build to develop a strong connection with your target audiences. Because ultimately, a meaningfully different relationship is what you want to accomplish as a brand. And that goes from making sure you are thought of in the right moment to positioning your brand, your idea, your service in a way that you're evaluated very positively compared to your direct competitors. So those are the layers that are important in building that strong customer brand equity. Thank you for the question.
All right, next question. How significant is the difference between the heavily affected brands versus mildly affected brands?
Oh, I thought I answered that one.
All right.
There's no difference. And my hypothesis was there shouldn't be a difference if they are global brands.
Sorry, the next one. How can local brands build their global brand premium to catch up to the local brands that have many years of head start?
Okay, so I think that head start or so that's a great question. And I think head start or kind of first mover advantage is in a changing environment not as relevant anymore. I think if we would follow Jeff Bezos and Amazon, who states that every day is a first day in Amazon, is actually to rethink and to jump onto new changes all the time. So I don't think there is so much of a first mover advantage unless there is a huge scale to be gained, like in platforms. But you see things changing a lot, and I think there's a lot of fragmentation in the market that emerges, and I think there's a lot of opportunities to redefine the market still. Yeah, I think the first mover advantage used to be more prominent in the past. Of course, still relevant in some industries, but in more creative industries, that is not the case anymore. Yeah. Hello, Vivian. I lost connection. Amit, would you take over?
Okay, so we have a few more questions. What are the barriers for ASEAN brands to tap in NAFTA markets? Like, Willem, what are the barriers for ASEAN brands to tap in NAFTA markets?
Yes. So I think there are the barriers. The barriers that are common for all of those brands from our region is that they're further away and that they're very different. And I think that unless there is extraordinary benefit of going to the US or the NAFTA market, then it's better to actually go to markets that are more similar and closer by. There are brands that go to the US market, for instance, because their international recognition in the US markets will actually have a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop at home. But if you don't have that desire of aim, then I would advise actually to take other choices as your internationalization market choices and go to much more markets that are closer by and that you have more knowledge of.
Okay, so there's another question. So what do you think of Gojek versus Grab massive competition in ASEAN, which even kicked out Uber from the region?
Yes, what do I think of that? As a consumer, I like competition. So as I think a marketing strategist, I would say it made sense to optimize the investments and not to waste a lot of promotion money without growing the market substantially. So there are kind of those two thoughts in my mind that says, as a consumer, it would have been nice that we would have had choice. As a marketing strategist, I must agree with the move. Thank you.
Okay, so with particular reference to food and beverages, tastes obviously differ from region to region. What trends or adaptation, if any, have food brands used to internationalize?
Great question. So, yes, I think what would be my branding answer to this, right? My extreme branding answer would actually argue like the product doesn't matter. So if we look at the Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, you clearly see there is no difference in hardly any taste difference. Some people claim that they can taste it, but they will still make many of those self-proclaimed cola experts would fail in a blind taste test. So I think that there's the product, but there's also how you communicate and package it, how you brand it, that can be locally adapted. And and that is what you always need to seek when you internationalize a product or beverages brand. So it's important to differentiate product from brand.
So the next question, thank you for the presentation. Would you mind sharing more your opinion about e-commerce in the ASEAN market after COVID-19?
Oh, okay. So it's not so much an observation, but that's what I hear from other practitioners in the field, is that they think that in this period of more being homebound and developing a habit to buy your groceries, either going run shopping or doing that online, I think that those new habits will actually last, I think, with a significant group. I think it will be, it will change footage. I think a footfall in many grocery stores. I think maybe more so in developed countries than in emerging countries. But I think it will be a big change because we're developing a new habit in these circumstances. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, when determining the value of certain brands, what are the most important factors to consider?
Okay. So the most important factors to consider is to start with your positioning. What do you offer to whom? And the offering, how is it different from the other choice they can make? And fourthly, as is part of a positioning statement, fourthly, what is the reason that people should believe what you're promising to them and why it is unique? So I would start with a strong positioning statement. That is the start of a strong branding strategy.
Okay, we have more questions. Okay, what is the most effective way to introduce a global brand into a third world country, given that global brands are at premium per se?
What I usually see in emerging countries is that that they have a higher regard of global brands than developed countries. And that premium, I think, helps the internationalization of global brands much more. And maybe that harms the development of premiumization of local brands, because there is that strong competition of these international global brands in that higher price range.
I have an interesting question here. Given that ASB is a young business school, how is ASB building its brand against regional players such as INSEAD, NUS, SEIBS? And do you consider ASB as an ASEAN brand or a hybrid, given the MIT association?
Okay, yes, that's a wonderful question. And that relates very much to what I said earlier, to the positioning statement. And the reason to believe is our strong MIT affiliation, our strong connection with MIT, then in building the school, but also with Bank Negara. That helps really to give voice, to give an ear to the propositions we develop. And it's fantastic to see the question that we are grouped with those top tier other schools. So our ambition is understood. How we do this is focusing on being unconventional and exceptional, very much focused on becoming a premier business school for the good of the emerging world, particularly in Asia, and to develop principled and transformative leaders. That is on how we position ourselves, as from the schools that are more traditionally focused on the typical conventional careers.
Okay, the hotel tourism industry is badly hit. What's your forecast on its market?
Oh, could you repeat the question again?
Okay, the hotel tourism industry is badly hit. What's your forecast on its market?
Oh, it's a very specific question. I think, so that's, what I think is that lockdowns across the world are longer than expected and will only be released more domestically. So maybe the focus for the tourism should, I think, should be more focused on local demand, domestic demand first, because I think opening up internationally will be later. But I think that if you're in that industry, you also know that a lot of other players think like that, because I think I'm outside of the industry and that is what I would guess. So I think you need to think ahead then in how you are going to be different from everyone that is going to anticipate this breaking down of the lockdown, first domestically and internationally. Next question.
Okay, we have more. So is the trend of craft products provenance in brand stories and local production sustainability present in ASEAN countries like they are in the West? So
yes. Yeah, I think that is a wonderful niche product. And I think there remains to be high demand for handcrafted, skillful, artful products. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe more so when people are more homebound.
So what about anti-GAFA sentiment playing role, data, Texas, etc.? Could ASEAN brands capitalize on this, or is the trend not yet here?
Okay, so I'm not aware of that trend. There is generally a more concern about data privacy across, and I think that will also grow in ASEAN. And I think as a digital player, I think you need to proactively think about those concerns, because that will also come here. I think that is a trend we will see spreading internationally from Europe to the US to here. And maybe that could actually hamper more Chinese players that have at home a looser data protection institutionalization structure. Yeah.
Okay, so how should ASEAN B2B companies create a brand? Will COVID affect the brand value of Chinese companies globally?
Okay, those are two questions, right? I think so. B2B brands are often, I think, in generally, are often underestimated. I think when people think of brands, people associate that with consumer products, and I think the brand value in business to business is hugely underestimated. I think actually the choice of buying or deciding in business to business situations, which come with often large amounts, large investments, and mean long-term commitment, is actually the choice of who to partner with becomes more important. And I think IBM was the one that kind of leveraged on that idea, meaning that they would say nobody has ever been fired for hiring IBM. So I think that awareness, I think first needs to grow, that reliability of service, responsiveness comes with building that relationship of your business partners, and for any business to business, that will lead to huge brand value for themselves. So I think first it starts with business to business firms realizing that there is a huge upside potential of building their brand.
Okay, so for those highly affected brands due to nCoV crisis, what's the most strategic way to regain their market position? Those affected brands due to COVID crisis, I guess.
Yep.
what is the most strategic way to regain their market position?
I think, so I think market position is always relative. So I think now everybody is down. I think important is to imagine different scenarios for which there is a post-COVID world, and think about at least 4 different scenarios that you can anticipate and what would be your actions. So I actually would advise strategic planning and scenario planning to anticipate the new normal, and then different types of new normal that you can think of. That could be your first positioning. That could be a new positioning later that you want to change strategy for. So I think strategy scenario planning is, I think you have to do that first. First do the internal work. Let's do 2 more questions, Hamid.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
2 more questions and we can wrap up. We've got about 3 minutes left.
All right.
So this is, is there an opportunity for African brands to enter ASEAN market?
So I think there is, yes. Why not? I think there's, yeah. I think with if you see the right potential and you position it well, you have the right partners to internationalize with. Why not? It starts with your positioning and how you want to win in those specific target markets in ASEAN. All starts with that.
Okay, so this
doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's in that sense, it doesn't matter. If you don't think it is important reason to mention it, but you mention other strengths that are relevant to the target audience, why should it matter where it comes from?
This is the final question. So
okay.
Some brands deceive their customers by posing as brand coming from a country where they are not actually based in, to benefit from a positive country association. So for example, ASEAN made watch with a Swiss sounding brand name. How sustainable is such a brand strategy in your experience?
Okay. Yes, that's a really nice question. Yes, I think it is so I think we need to separate 2 different situations. Maybe there are already successful brands that have built that reputation. I think in Malaysia there's, I think, Spritzer water, which kind of sounds more German, but is a very much from Perak water, which is a great company that sells lots of water to the country. But another one, I think if you start new brands, and I think that's what I want to focus the answer on, is you need to think about which brand elements you want to use. The name, the logo, the stories you're going to tell. And I think in this day and age, where authenticity of brands is so important, kind of obfuscating or beautifying your country of origin doesn't help any longer. So I think for young brands, new starting, be truthful where you're from, but actually emphasize what you're good at and what that helps your target audience. Yes.
All right, and with that, we are going to end tonight's session. Thank you everyone for taking your time to join us today. So this is just an example of faculty with relevant, real-time, real-world Asia content. So we hope you found this webinar informative, just like we did. And we hope to see you again in the next webinar, in the next masterclass session, in fact. So thank you, and have a good day, good night, wherever you are, and we hope to see you soon.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.